So all of you that are joining us this afternoon, very much good welcome to you. Good afternoon, or whatever time it is, wherever you are. I'm Juliet Carbo. I'm a co-director of the Center for Security Research, and I'm going to chair this event. The center is very pleased to sponsor this presentation by Dr. Joseph Fitsanakis, who will shortly be introduced a little bit more fully. I want to make a few points on housekeeping here. We are recording at this moment, and we're going to record through Dr. Fitsanakis' presentation, but we will turn off recording once we start the question and answer. So everybody should feel free to join in that way. Again, please keep your video and audio on mute during this session unless I call on you to ask questions during that period. After the presentation, there will be time to ask questions and have a short discussion, and I will call on those who have raised their hand with the hand raise function, or I can ask some of the questions for you if you post them in the chat. We're going to dismantle the chat during the presentation just to minimize distraction, but open that up during question and answer time. And the session will end at 4:30 UK time. Dr. Fitsanakis is here to talk to us today about Spies and the virus, COVID-19, and intelligence forewarning in the United States. The topic is very appropriate for today. It is the year anniversary of the UK's first lockdown, and today is a national day of reflection in the UK for the lives lost to this deadly disease. The topic is also appropriate for the Center for Security Research. Not only is global health an important area of international security, but we also regularly sponsor Spy Week, an annual literary event here at the University of Edinburgh. So we are pleased to have Dr. Fitsanakis here with us virtually to present his research on intelligence, biosecurity, and biodefense. And he's a particularly special guest as he is an alumnus of Edinburgh, so we thought it would be appropriate for our colleague, Professor Charles Robb, who was one of Joseph's supervisors when he was a student here, to briefly introduce him. So, Charles?
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody, and welcome particularly Joe Fitsanakis. Joe was supervised for his PhD by myself and by Professor Robin Williams, who was also in the audience. And that was about 20 years ago when Joe had a particular interest in his PhD thesis, if I recall correctly, in looking at intelligence services and the relationship to business companies and industry. And so forth, particularly with regard to the USA. It was a very happy experience, I can tell you, Joe, supervising you, because you listened to everything we said about how you should go about it, but you also dug your heels in quite nicely on your own thoughts, your own methods, and so on. I really haven't kept touch with Joe, to my regret, over the many years, but I've followed from a distance the things that he's been doing in the USA. And it occurred to me that having seen his name attached to an article on the topic that he's talking about today, I would read the article and then propose that he be invited here virtually to, I wish it were in real time, virtually to give this talk. So with fond memories and also looking forward to a very interesting talk, welcome, Joe.
Thank you, Charles. It's truly an honor to be here today, back in my alma mater of Edinburgh University. May I also point out I'm still a proud member of the Edinburgh University Beer Society. Almost 20 years after graduating, one of my recurring nightmares is coming back to the city after many years and finding out that the Jolly Judge pub is not there anymore. But what a great time I had while I was there. And of course, I was a first generation student going to college for my family. And when I began my PhD under Charles and of course Robin Williams, who's also in the audience, glad to see him here. I didn't know what I was doing, to be honest. I pretended that I did, and I think I did a very good job of that one. But now that I myself, as a professor of political science, supervise students, I try to show them the same patience and respect that I was shown by both Charles and Robin. So it's so wonderful to be here today. Of course, another thing that's important to me is that the topic. I know that it is a very painful anniversary this week. We all remember what it was like a year ago and what has happened in the preceding 12 months. But I will say that I think that this topic really highlights the interdisciplinary nature of security studies. And I know specifically this center is here for this reason, to basically make the point that we can't understand this field of research without bringing in all kinds of contributions from fields that may have little in common in theory, but in this aspect, they're very much interconnected. So I'm very much hoping that the discussion that follows my presentation is going to reflect that reality of security studies. My interest in the topic that I'm talking about today, the coronavirus and the security aspects of it, really begins from the fact that I am a professor in a political science program, but specializing in government and in particular its relation with the intelligence community, as we call it here in the United States. Our program, the Intelligence and Security Studies program here at Coastal Carolina University, is one of about a handful of undergraduate programs in this field. And it combines two things: a critical analysis of intelligence with professional training for students that the majority of whom enters government work in some capacity or other. I will also say, of course, that part of the grounding of our program here is highlighting the difference between living in a secure state and living in a security state. The two are very much different from each other. We try to highlight that and ground this into our students. I will also say that my own personal expertise or interest in intelligence can basically be summarized in I work on topics relating to intelligence collection, collecting information that may be of interest to the security of a nation, but also dissemination, essentially methods and ways in which you can transfer that information to the people that make decisions. And of course, again, it's a critical approach, but at the same time, it does focus on training effectiveness of this, hence the topic that we're talking about today. The article that Charles mentioned that kind of gave the impetus for our gathering today was basically triggered by comments that the then president of the United States, Donald Trump, made in relation to the coronavirus. I'm going to give you a quote here from one of those from March 6th, so pretty much a year ago. This virus, quote, came out of nowhere. Nobody saw it coming. And another one here from one of his speeches, an invisible enemy which snuck up on us and which nobody could have predicted. We in our program, we're kind of lucky enough to have several students who are working in the field, former students, who are now working in the field of biomedical security. And it only took, my colleagues and I, only took us about a couple of phone calls to find out that these quotes, let's see, what's the technical term here? The president was lying through his teeth, essentially. I could have been forgiven March 6th in sort of like the surprise that this virus caused among the executive areas of government here in the States to have said that. By June, surely he knew that was not the case. In fact, saying that is actually kind of an insult in a major way to the United States Defense Intelligence Program, to my knowledge, somebody here might be able to correct me on this if I'm not right, the oldest in the world. In fact, it has its roots in a project that began in the Central Intelligence Agency called Project Impact. It wasn't easy to find information about this project in the open domain. However, what we have gathered for this article that, again, triggered today's meeting is pretty much all that exists in the open domain. So that, interestingly enough, began with a focus on China. During the Cultural Revolution, there was actually a couple of major meningitis outbreaks throughout China, and kind of shook the local society. The Chinese unit of the CIA was interested in protecting its assets and, of course, its officers in China at the time. And that was what created Project Impact, the first systematic attempt by a U.S. government agency to trace an outbreak of a disease in a foreign country. That eventually was sort of packaged into a broader project, Project Black Flag, which essentially was an attempt by the CIA to computerize this disease information on a global scale, and even in some cases try to forecast trends of different diseases and how they would affect the health, the security, the stability of different nations, including, of course, China at the time. That really was kind of like the central pillar that eventually became the sort of the basis of the U.S. intelligence community's disease intelligence program, whose mission is kind of a threefold mission. First, to collect intelligence about the extent, the spread of different diseases around the world, which, of course, the numbers of people infected, the dynamism of the infection of the disease may be often concealed by different nations, either on purpose or not. Cases that come to mind, of course, in the case of the coronavirus was Iran, very notably China, although I would argue that in many Western nations, Britain included, actually did not do a great job either in alerting us or even gathering this information and giving us accurate statistics, even today. Second, to forecast the consequences of these diseases for American interests, American national security, and of course, lastly, providing those who make decisions with critical forewarning in terms of protecting the nation. Basically, the question is, if a disease is present abroad, how long will it be before it comes to the United States, whether it's Ebola or, in our case, of course, the coronavirus. So imagine, I guess, what I'm trying to make, the point I'm trying to make is here, imagine being one of those experts who work in this field for the U.S. intelligence community and hearing your own president say that nobody could have predicted that, disregarding, of course, your existence, essentially. And that brings me to the other part of my presentation today, which is the actual forewarnings. Our article that was co-authored with two of my collaborators, Anna Maria Langford and Derek Storzier here at Coastal Carolina University, did kind of a fact-finding, essentially, research to see whether the president's statements were actually correct. The fact that it is not correct begins, the proof that it is not correct begins with warnings issued many years ago, actually, by the National Intelligence Council. I don't expect people here necessarily to know the intricacies of the U.S. intelligence community. It's a very complicated intelligence community, as is typical of the American political landscape. It is gargantuan, actually. Not every country has the same model of intelligence as the United States, which means that America has something like 18. Now we have another one this year. The Space Force has now joined the U.S. intelligence community, making the agencies that constituted 18, can you believe it? So the Office of the Director of National Intelligence basically is a sort of the coordinating body of all of these government agencies that do intelligence, and it specializes in providing long-term strategic analysis of both existing and, of course, emerging threats. The focus here is on things that are not necessarily on the radar of decision makers and policymakers. And the first warning that we found goes back to almost 15, 16 years ago in 2004 in a publication, an open source publication and an openly available publication by the National Intelligence Council called Mapping the Global Future. And I'm quoting from this publication. It's only a matter of time before a new pandemic appears, such as, of course, the influenza virus of the 1918-19 that killed about 20 million people worldwide. In 2008, the same body, the National Intelligence Council, published Global Trends 2025. And again, a quote from this, the most plausible scenario is the emergence of a novel, highly transmissible, virulent human respiratory illness for which there are no adequate countermeasures. Of course, with hindsight, this seems so accurate, and you will see in a minute that these warnings become even more accurate with time. Another quote from this publication, such an outbreak would likely originate in China, as it is a country that is very densely populated, where humans tend to live in some rural areas, of course, in close quarters with livestock. But that's just the beginning. In 2012, during the MERS virus that hit predominantly the Middle Eastern region, another publication, the National Intelligence Council's Global Trends 2023 states, and I'm quoting, an easily transmissible novel respiratory pathogen that kills or incapacitates more than 1% of its victims is among the most disruptive events possible. Let me remind you all here today that the coronavirus's death rate remains stable at about 3% of existing cases. Such an outbreak would result or could result in millions of people suffering and dying in every corner of the world in less than 6 months. That's the statement of this publication. It goes on to say that, interestingly, globalization would be threatened if the death toll rose into the millions in several major countries. And of course, that would, as we have seen, in fact, put a halt to global travel and trade during an extended period. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence also publishes the Worldwide Threat Assessment of the U.S. intelligence community. It's an annual publication that essentially highlights the greatest concerns of the U.S. intelligence community as a whole, all 17 and now all 18 of these intelligence agencies. We read in the oldest reference to a respiratory virus that we can find. We read in the 2013 document the following statement: an easily transmissible novel respiratory pathogen that kills or incapacitates more than 1% of its victims is, quote, not a hypothetical threat. History, then it goes on to say that history is full of these examples that have caused massive political, economic disruption, and even influenced the outcomes of wars worldwide. In 2015, so again, this is an annual publication, and we tend to see after 2013, essentially the same warning in increasing intensity appear in these publications. Infectious diseases are among the foremost security threats. For the intelligence community to use a term like foremost, they weigh the words very carefully. So this is an important statement in this, again, annual publication. And of course, it mentions the kind of the paradox here of globalization, which is that, of course, it increases economic opportunities while at the same time creating security threats, including the spread, the fast nature of the spread of a potential coronavirus in the past, with lack of adequate transportation routes and infrastructure the spread wouldn't have been as drastic, as dramatic as what we saw in the case of the coronavirus in 2019 and 2020. 2018, we are not adequately prepared for such an event, which is likely to cause a strain on the resources of government. And of course, we saw that too in the US context, in which the government was completely unable to respond to the demands of a huge country such as the United States. I'm not going to bore you with the gamut of information that we found in official government documents. Suffice to say that our article contains the majority of the existing references to warnings, and from the years 2004 till basically the eve of the outbreak of this virus. I will say that there are many documents from the Pentagon as well, the Council of Economic Affairs of the US government. I mean, there are tons and tons of documents that the president's comments basically just ignore, pretend they are not there. But what are the sort of the general observations that we can make from these documents as a whole? I would say that if you were to do a kind of qualitative analysis, some of the terms, and then statistically kind of map out the terms that appear in these documents, we see that the language evolves substantially as the US intelligence community over time becomes increasingly certain that this is not a hypothetical concern. The terminology is notably, it's actually quite interesting to see how it changes from very estimative, speculative at first to, by 2019, formulating direct forewarnings about the catastrophic consequences, not just for the US, but globally, of such an eventuality. So basically a year before the outbreak of the coronavirus, we see essentially an open sounding of the alarm by the ODNI, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, about precisely the dangers associated with a respiratory virus of the kind that COVID can be categorized as. And I would say this as well, that what's interesting also is that those kind of warnings, and this is an important note that I'm going to kind of draw your attention to in a few minutes, were mostly appearing in documents or products of the US intelligence community that are mostly strategic in nature, basically looking at the big picture kind of forecast, which typically we find that policymakers don't really pay much attention to. They're far more concerned about next week than say 3, 4, 5, 10 years from now. But what's concerning, and I'm speaking here more or less as a professor of political science and more as a US citizen, is the response of the Trump administration in particular to these warnings. What we saw, in fact, it was not just a disregard of these statements by the intelligence community, but essentially going the opposite route, going the opposite direction, a systematic demotion of the idea of pandemic preparedness as part of a national strategy of the United States. Some of you will have heard this, would have seen reference to this in the press, where basically the Obama administration, which Trump, of course, replaced in 2017 rather, created this kind of playbook on what to do in a case of a pandemic. And there was basically a kind of a simulation that took place between Obama administration officials and Trump administration officials in early 2017, where basically they were trying to figure out how to compare notes and pass on their knowledge of that document to the new administration. What's interesting, and this is, yes, I am making a reference to Joseph Stalin in this context. You know how in the Politburo in the 1930s, people kept disappearing. Something similar actually happened in the Trump administration, when you have the people who were there at the beginning of the administration basically just kind of disappear from history. So by 2019, when the pandemic actually struck, not a single person from those who were participating in that simulation were to be found anymore in the White House. So that disruption was critical for the catastrophe that basically followed the appearance of the coronavirus. I am fortunate enough to be married to a neuroscientist who is also a toxicologist specializing in poisons. So she has alerted me to the fact that the scientific community was very much aware of this demotion of pandemic preparedness. The CDC was defunded by a huge quantity of funds in 2017 by the Trump administration. This again was very much echoed in the scientific press, not so much, I have to say, in the research of my colleagues in political science. In 2018, we basically saw the one person left in the Trump administration that basically alerted everybody to the fact that they were not prepared for a pandemic, being fired overnight after making a statement to that effect. And John Bolton, at the time an aide to President Trump, national security aide, basically disbanded overnight the global health security team of the National Security Council of the United States. All this stuff became monumentally important in the months that followed. Perhaps most notably in 2019, President Trump, desperate to find funds to pay for the wall in the Mexican-American border, defunded the CDC of $300 million to launch an ad campaign to convince Americans that that was a worthwhile project to take. So now, of course, we know now, in fact, some of the most well-researched analysis of what happened in the elections of the past year that I've seen basically state that if it weren't for the mishandling of the coronavirus pandemic, Trump would have been reelected president. So I know for a fact, or we can tell with assuredness, that Trump did not do this on purpose. So why exactly was the Trump administration so dismissive of these types of statements, these types of warnings? That I think goes back to sort of one of the basic principles of intelligence, which is the intelligence cycle. For those of you who are not, and I'm assuming the majority here today, don't have perhaps necessarily a particular interest in intelligence studies as I do, I would say that the intelligence cycle is how intelligence is produced, analyzed, and then passed on to those who make decisions. It begins, of course, with requirements. When an intelligence agency gets a request from a government official, could be Department of State, NRO. There's again a bunch of agencies that get these kinds of requests. Could be military, could be civilian, to find something that the government cannot determine with open channels of information. So that leads to planning and direction, where the intelligence community gets together and figures out how best to go answering that question that is posed to them by the policymakers. That leads to a bunch of sessions where strategy is kind of like planned and detailed, leads to collection. Part of the things that I study is how this information is collected in the field through various means, surreptitious, sometimes, often, in fact, open source. The next step, and I'm going very fast because this is not really the point that I'm trying to make, but it leads to a major point that I want to make toward the end. Exploiting and processing the information, where basically the information that is collected in the field comes to the intelligence community, which then kind of makes sure that it's enough to answer the question. And if it is, it goes on to the next step, which is the analysis and production of the information, preparing it basically for the next step, which is dissemination to the policymaker. Essentially, you go to them and you present what you've been able to find, typically in an oral fashion. But as we have seen in this presentation, there's also plenty of written products that are disseminated. And technically, what's supposed to happen next is the policymaker is supposed to reach out to the intelligence community to let them know if they're satisfied with this. If not, the cycle begins again. Or in the case of Donald Trump, they can also be told to go back to school because the president doesn't agree with the data that you've given them, because it doesn't agree with their worldview, which is something we see, unfortunately, increasingly often in the realms of government in the United States. The question of the coronavirus catastrophe in the US context, and by the way, I would love to hear any thoughts here among the people who are gathered with us today about the British experience, to be able to compare it. The question of whether that was an intelligence disaster, basically, do we have enough intelligence, I think based on at least our research can be answered quite definitively. This was not a disaster relating to collection or to analysis and production. In fact, the warnings were there. It's mostly a disaster that relates to dissemination. The most notable, there's many cases of intelligence catastrophes that relate to dissemination. In history, I would argue the most notable example of this is Operation Barbarossa. Those of you who are into military history, you will know, of course, it was the largest land invasion in recorded history, where practically the entirety of the German Wehrmacht attacked the Soviet Union in June of 1941. The question that many historians have had for a while was, how is it possible that the Soviets couldn't have known about this massive transfer of troops to the Soviet border and the eventual attack? We know now, thanks to a bunch of books, including most recent example, What Stalin Knew by former Berlin CIA Chief of Station David Murphy, which basically collects the information that is available of what Stalin knew. We have the actual evidence of actual warnings given to Stalin by a very effective and very broad intelligence network within Germany, Japan, even Britain and the United States, basically warning not just about the invasion, but the date that was going to happen, and then Stalin basically saying, it's disinformation, I'm not interested in that, this is clearly a lie, and dismissing it. We actually have Stalin's statements or written notes in the margins of the actual intelligence product. And realize, again, this is the second reference I'm making to Stalin in this presentation. Take that as you will. What is that? How does that translate into the US context? I would say that, and then looking at more broadly at the sphere of intelligence collection, analysis, dissemination, historically, I would say that dissemination is the weakest link in intelligence scholarship. Scholars like me, others who may be here today, we're very keen on studying things like operations because they're very kind of sexy and everybody wants to talk about them. A lot of analysis is also in the minds of researchers, but with the exception of just a few books, the dissemination, how do you pass this on to the policymaker in a way that's effective and convincing, has not really been studied very much. I would say that based on my experience and what I've seen in my research, the relations between the US intelligence community and the consumers of intelligence, the policymakers, decision makers, military officials, et cetera, are highly, highly dysfunctional. And I think the catastrophe of this pandemic, at least in the US context, is definitely connected or rooted in these very fraught relations. Our paper actually, though, blames both sides. In fact, we're looking at many cases in the past where we've seen this happen before, notably in 2003, when the United States invaded Iraq. Much has been made, of course, of the fiasco of the Iraqi WMD sort of assessments by the intelligence community of not just America, but also, of course, Britain. But a lot less attention has been paid to another kind of assessment made at the time by the intelligence community, stating that if the US invades Iraq and deposes the government of Saddam Hussein, there will almost certainly be a civil war of large proportions, large magnitude in that country. And I'm showing you here news articles that came out in the last 10 years or so, because really there aren't any research articles I can point you to, which I think is quite disappointing in terms of the research availability of this very important topic. We saw a similar event happen during the Obama administration, when basically Barack Obama had decided that he was going to leave Iraq. It was not a war worth fighting. Of course, he voted against it as himself, as a senator. He was going to keep his promise. He was warned by the intelligence community that if he did that, I mean, you own it now, you broke it, you own it, this is your problem. You can't just leave like that. That might create a backlash by Sunni militants in the shape, of course, of ISIS. And there was a kind of a minor scandal at the time in the United States where the Defense Intelligence Agency analysts warned or complained that their warnings have been watered down by the time they got to the decision makers, basically warning about what a fast, quick American pullout would do to the situation in Iraq. We actually make several suggestions, proposals for how to make sure this doesn't happen again. Among them, we kind of note the fact, and this is something that's coming out of our contacts with people in the intelligence community. We consulted several in writing this article. Only 2 of them, of course, were able to kind of give us their names and allow us to use their names in the article, but several more, at least a dozen more, did not for obvious reasons. They mentioned that they find that not just with Trump, but generally policymakers now are expecting the intelligence community to kind of behave like the 24-hour television news cycle. With Trump, of course, the obsession with Fox News was very much noted by the people we spoke to. They're looking for information that is easily digestible, black and white, yes or no, which of course the intelligence community never does. They always use probabilities, right? With certainty and immediacy that of course is not there in the real world, right? The problem, of course, is that some of you would know this, that the U.S. intelligence community is obsessed. In fact, I think it fetishizes collection of information as opposed to remembering that there's already plenty of stuff that have been collected, and often they delay issuing this kind of products because they're waiting for the newest information to come out, when in fact, chances are you already have this stuff in your archives, in your records already, because of the sort of the massive collection effort that is the U.S. intelligence community. I would also say, and we make this point in the article, that strategic intelligence products that kind of focus on 10, 20, 30 years down the road, even 5 years down the road, are not adequate mechanisms for intelligence forewarning, right? The kind of notable intelligence scholar, Arthur Hulnick, who also served, I think, 30 years in the CIA, has written in his book, Fixing the Spy Machine, that these kinds of strategic products are meant more like basically abstractions that rarely have the attention of people who are more concerned about what's happening next week or next day, like the president. News articles mentioned that the president had been warned about this in the quote-unquote president's daily brief. That, of course, remains classified, which is a kind of a daily update the president gets from the intelligence community. At the same time, though, people that we spoke in the intelligence community tell us that the president's daily brief is basically seen as optional equipment, educational material, which in fact Trump himself basically just stopped attending after a while because his relations with the intelligence community were very, very negative, let's put it this way. Biden, news reports state today that he will bring it back. We'll see if that happens with the frequency that I think it deserves. We also strongly recommend that there should be some kind of a more direct line of communication between the intelligence community and the policymaker in the form of like a red phone, if you can remember that from back in the Cold War, for catastrophic potential events. And lastly, we propose that the intelligence community essentially be allowed to advise policymakers on their policy options. This is something kind of peculiar to the American scene, to the American landscape, where intelligence producers, the intelligence community, are not allowed or not encouraged to tell the policymaker what to do. They only focus on the data and what may or may not happen, but don't advise them. And I think that when it comes to catastrophic potential dangers is somewhat of an error, somewhat of a mistake. Let me close with this in terms, and I know that, again, I would love to see where this discussion in the next hour or so that we have goes. It can go in all kinds of directions, but let me share with you some of what I think are some of the broader issues and implications of this topic. To begin with, of course, I know the Trump administration is not a typical administration. It's a kind of a shocking, in so many ways, administration for the American context. I mean, this is a president where when asked whether he trusted his own intelligence community about Russian meddling in the US elections or the Russian government, in public at the Helsinki meeting between him and President Putin, he actually said he trusts the Russians and not his own intelligence community. So I get that. I would say, though, that some of the elements of this sort of disconnect between the intelligence community and the executive are not all that rare in the U.S. intelligence setting. In fact, I believe that is a major problem of trust and fragmentation within the sort of the core apparatus of the American government, the increasing partisanship that we're seeing, the division, the sectarianism, even within administrations that we're seeing lately in the United States, is affecting this in a very, very negative way. A lot of us who work in intelligence focus a lot on this idea of a silo, essentially government agencies that don't communicate with each other while working on the same things. I think much less attention has been paid in scholarship of the silos that exist between the intelligence producers and the intelligence consumers in the form of the policymakers, decision makers, and so on and so forth. So this silos is something that I think we're going to really struggle with in the coming years of uncertainty that we have before us. An example of this, a dramatic example, in fact, was back in 2002, 2003, when the Bush administration at the time, desperate to find a way to get into Iraq with an army, basically Dick Cheney created his own intelligence agency in the office of the vice president to basically try to cook intelligence information to make it look like Iraq was an imminent threat to the United States. I think we're going to see a lot more of that. In fact, I would argue that what happened in the case of the coronavirus was essentially the Trump administration creating its own intelligence structure in parallel to the official one, to basically kind of create information that fit its own worldview, which was that the coronavirus was not a major threat to U.S. way of life. Essentially, it was just the sniffles, basically, as Trump liked to say. If in fact there was, of course, bad blood between the Trump administration and the intelligence community that we could have seen in the previous years. I mean, Trump kept calling them the deep state and what have you, but I think that became a lot more pronounced during this time of crisis. I would say that in terms of what's coming, I think, and many of you may have opinions on this or thoughts on this, that the post-pandemic landscape that we're going to see is going to include essentially a massive renegotiation of the relationship between the government and the governed, with all kinds of arrangements that are going to be changing, I think, or at least there's going to be pressure for those to change. And for that to work in a smooth way, it is absolutely essential for government to also gain the trust of the population. And I think that what we're seeing in America right now, and then the broader political context, is exactly the opposite. I'm very concerned, and many of my colleagues in political science are very concerned about these conspiracy theories that are actually becoming very active political forces in the US context. We also what happened on the 6th of January of this year, for example, terrified when we saw this in our television screens. And lastly, I would say this. I'm using the term human agency, of course, in the classic political science sense, the sort of historical dynamic of collective action within a certain environment and how decisions are made. What we saw in the case of the coronavirus was that this human agency within the US government became incredibly shrunk between basically a handful of people that made decisions, disregarding the wealth of expertise, the wealth of information, the wealth of specialization that we have in the US intelligence community today. I think when the research comes out, eventually it's going to show that basically 2 or 3 people in the entire US government made decisions during those days. And that didn't even include people like the Vice President of the United States, right? And I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the years to come. And on that positive message, I'm going to say thank you for your attention, and I so much look forward to your comments and questions.
Great, thank you very much. So we'll take down your screen sharing there. Okay. Thank you very much. That was a really interesting presentation, very thoughtful and well presented. I like how you began with the historical origins of the biological defense program. You gave us lots of information about how this was not a surprise or shouldn't have been a surprise to anybody. And I know that's just the tip of the iceberg of the evidence that you present in the paper. I appreciate your attention to that intelligence cycle, to the policy recommendations, and then those broader implications that you end with. And I just personally, especially like your last point on agency, I myself study the psychology of leaders and how their personalities and their psychological processes affect how they react to information, and that side's important, but I think what you gave us is just as important, the other side of that, the production of that information. You raised yourself, and I know Professor Rob raised this with you before we got started, the issue of how generalizable this is, right? So a lot of the things that you noted are a bit unique to the American context, as certainly the size of the intelligence, and the structure of the intelligence community. But I think it begs the question, and perhaps this will come up in question and answer. We have a lot of states that didn't get this right? We have a lot of countries that didn't get coronavirus right, and is it due to some of those same dynamics? All right, so those are just my initial reflections. I really enjoyed it, as I'm sure you can tell. I want to open it up to other questions, and as I said, you can raise your hand using the reactions button at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and I'll call on you. I know I have an undergraduate student working on her dissertation on the relationship between top policymakers and U.S. intelligence, and I'm hoping she's here. I know I'll send this recording to her. We are stopping recording at this point now, right? Right, Andrew? And so.